and some of it is ideological.
Okay, we're now on to our last two sessions.
It's just
And
an incomprehension.
As you've seen with the first four sessions, all aces. So, yeah, I can promise you that the last two sessions are as good as the first four were panel sessions. The graders are of the same quality, and so I need everybody to behave and get back in their seats because we're about to have one hell of an excursion on this one. Ambassador Herbst is like our wonderful ambassadors, Taylor and Courtney. You can tell a not good iron fist, and they're going us on time. Yes, sir. Yes, thank you. It's all yours, sir. And on the important issue of social cohesion, whether Ukraine has been basically torn apart and run down by this war internally. And that's an important question for us, a fundamental question. So, Ambassador Herbst, it's all yours.
Okay, I'm going to cut to the chase and tell you that most of the news regarding social cohesion in Ukraine is quite positive. There are problems in Ukraine relating to this massive war filled with war crimes, as well as, of course, issues of reform and corruption. But one of the great stories of Ukraine since independence has been the way groups that in the past did not necessarily get along, today get along. Having given away the headline, we'll have our speakers talk about this in more detail. All right, so we have a wonderful panel. We have virtually Kateryna Shynkaruk, who's of the Bush School of Governance at Texas A&M, and she's with us virtually. We have to my immediate left Ambassador James Gilmore, who was the ambassador to the OSCE during the first Trump term and also a Republican governor of the great state of Virginia before that. And to his left, we have my old friend Ilan Berman, Senior Vice President of the American Foreign Policy Council and a purveyor of good sense on virtually everything national security. And then to his left, we have Thomas Lang, who's the founder and CEO of Rebuilding the Ukraine Association, who says Walter calls on him whenever he needs things built. And so with that, we'll turn first to our virtual speaker. Kateryna, you feel free to comment on any of the possible fault lines in Ukrainian society, for example, between different ethnic groups, different faith groups, or anything else you choose to comment on, including the resilience of Ukraine dealing with this massive, savage war conducted by, right now, the world's principal war criminal, Vladimir Putin. Будь ласка.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for letting me join this esteemed panel, and thank you, Ambassador Herbst, for these questions. I was also looking, as I was preparing to speak, I was also looking into the questions of social cohesion and various variables, including the potential division lines in Ukrainian society. Actually, the question of sustainability and stability of Ukraine's social contract, especially after 2022, and to what extent it has evolved between 2022 and now, and what does it have to say to us when it comes to social cohesion and resilience of Ukraine's society. And so basically, based on all these criteria and variables, we can say that, of course, there is some dynamic between the remarkable unity and resilience that Ukrainians demonstrated in 2022 and thereafter. And now that we are in the fourth year, and obviously everybody understands that it's a marathon, not a sprint, but otherwise, I agree with Ambassador Herbst's optimistic evaluation of the situation in Ukraine society right now, given the scale of challenges. And I'm currently in Kyiv, which is being shelled dramatically over the past months and weeks, and even yesterday. And all of this just underscores the remarkable resilience and unity of the Ukrainian society facing the challenges of Putin's war crimes and all kinds of internal and external pressures, including the economic, the social ones, the challenge of mobilization, the challenge of basically addressing all kinds of subversive efforts from Russia to rock the boat, to undermine social unity. I will break down a couple of those items, but I realize that we are pressed on time, so I'll try to be brief. Basically, when we look at the, for example, at the criteria of interfaith unity, it is remarkable how interdenominational unity is being displayed within Ukraine. And they're basically unity among different religious confessions, with only one exception of the basically Moscow-sponsored church, which is basically seen mostly just as a hand of Russia's political influence and subversive operations. So if we just take out of the equation the Moscow church, otherwise there is a remarkable unity which is boosted by the idea that Ukrainians need to survive and need to win. And overall, even now, there is over 60% of Ukrainians, according to social pollings, who agree that Ukraine needs to achieve the goals of basically not only surviving in this war, but basically avoiding any sort of ending that would be sounding like capitulation or surrender, and even recognizing that the price for this is high. Over 60% of Ukrainians are ready to persevere as long as it takes. This is also basically something that might go against the media narratives and the expectations that that fatigue is prevailing. So, despite the fatigue, Ukrainians are willing to continue and to basically invest into victory in every way possible. And although there is this hard conversations about mobilization and hard conversation about how to make those choices both realistic and just when it comes to society, there is nevertheless overall still this social contract being upheld that Ukrainians are willing to fight. And the main challenge that is currently being discussed is that Ukrainians are willing to sacrifice and basically join the armed forces, but they do not appreciate the methods. The main criticism is not about the willingness to sacrifice. The main criticism is about the methods that should be more partnership with between government and the citizens rather than forceful mobilization. So this is basically the main challenge so far. There are other challenges that I can highlight when it comes to all kinds of division lines between Ukrainians who are inside the country and outside the country, Ukrainians who are in the armed forces and outside of the armed forces, Ukrainians who are in the armed forces, whether they are fighting on the front line or whether they are somewhere in the deeper in the country. The level of engagement when it comes to supporting the army financially and in every other way. So there are those division lines, and obviously Russians are trying to apply their subversive efforts in shaking the unity in the society. But nevertheless, we see that there is still a lot of potential to persevere and to continue with those basically consistent efforts to invest into Ukraine's victory, despite all those external challenges and obviously a very different geopolitical context since 2025. A very good and clear indicator of this social contract of unity for the sake of victory being still upheld are the domestic, the political situation inside the country. That there is still no demand or appetite for domestic internal elections, despite the conversation that has been coming on and off whether Ukraine needs to be whether Ukraine needs to hold elections during the martial law. There is a consensus between the opposition, civil society, and broader social moods that while Ukraine is waging the war against Russia, there is no appetite, and it would be clearly destructive to have currently, some sort of domestic competition related to elections. So there is no push for elections, which again demonstrates unity around different goals of fighting Russia. Overall, given all this criteria that I was considering and that were outlined for evaluating social cohesion, I would say that I personally would grade it somewhere between 70 and 80%. I will wrap up at this point and thank you for your attention.
Thank you for that strong and economical presentation. Remember, we're operating under Walter's firm directions. So, Governor Gilmore, you have 9 minutes maximum.
9 minutes.
Okay, I know we've been challenged today on audio visual. Can people hear me out there? You can hear me, all right? Okay. All right, let me try to do a few things. When I actually came to this event, I wanted to attend the entire event because I thought I'd learn a lot, and I actually have learned a lot here today. But I came in believing that the Israel-Iran war was a distraction of what we were talking about today, and I think it's not. I think what I've learned today is about the unity of the Russian and Iranian national goals and how it all works together in a way. I continue to believe that the Ukraine war is the pivot of the 21st century. I think we're in a worldwide war right now, but I believe that the pivot of the future rests in Ukraine, and I've been saying that pretty continuously. So just by way of quick background, I was appointed United States ambassador to the OSCE by President Trump in 2019 and served there until President Biden was elected in 2021. I believe I was appointed to that ambassadorship because nobody thought the OSCE was very important, and therefore I got the position. But I accomplished a lot and learned a lot by being the ambassador there. When I arrived in Vienna to take that post, this organization is 57 countries. It includes everybody in Europe and everybody in the Northern Hemisphere, but it also includes both Ukraine and Russia. And at that time, in 2019, there was no informal invasion at that point of Ukraine, although the East was occupied by renegade Ukrainians led by the Russian regular forces. The OSCE had over 1,000 monitors in Eastern Ukraine at that time in order to try to keep a lid on and to give some early warning about problems and then to watch the movement of the Russian resources and people in and out of Eastern Ukraine. As ambassador, I met every week with the Ukrainian ambassador. I met with, in fact, about at least every week with about 12 of the key ambassadors, but I also met with the Ukrainian ambassador, and I came to appreciate and understand something that a lot of people don't understand, which was that Ukraine was a nation. It was sitting in the Permanent Council as a nation. Their ambassador was there to represent a country. And that has stuck with me through all this time, and of course is contrary to what Putin thinks. I was there to deliver the United States message into the Permanent Council every week. and stated the American position, which was communicating both to allies and prospective adversaries about where the U.S. was and what our position was in various issues, including, of course, at that point, Crimea, which the United States never recognized as having been actually annexed by Russia. I learned something else while I was there. I learned about the concept of hybrid warfare. As a matter of fact, there was a conference that I was chairing that was going to be focused on the conflicts that were going on in Europe. And I talked to the Russians and said, I'm looking forward to leading a discussion on hybrid warfare. And they said, we absolutely won't discuss hybrid warfare. Well, that's because they were doing hybrid warfare, and they are still doing hybrid warfare. But there is one point that I want to make to the listeners here today on this issue of hybrid warfare. Americans have a tendency, in my view, to segment out things and think about war and negotiation and diplomacy and all that, and maybe here and maybe there. And we sort of tend as Americans to try to deal with things one piece at a time. Hybrid warfare teaches us that it's all the same thing. It's all the same thing all the time. Economic with sanctions, military, messaging, it's all the same thing. And furthermore, let me tell you what it is. It's all politics. One of the comments earlier today was, well, politics goes away when war begins. War is politics. War is the use of military activities in order to achieve a political goal. That's what it is. So it's all politics, and we need to remember that. People are carrying out national missions for a political goal. And if they can do it, by the way, through negotiations or diplomacy, they'll do that rather than sacrifice men. But if they can't do that, they'll be happy to go to war. It's all a matter of the same thing. Now, I'll mention that beyond the Vienna experience as United States ambassador, Herman Pirchner was kind enough to invite me to go with the American Foreign Policy Council to Ukraine in 2021. And there are some things on this topic, Ambassador, that I learned while I was there. And we're talking to all the various leaders and all the people that I saw in Ukraine. I learned that that they saw themselves as being a very different people. They were not Russians, and they don't want to be Russians. And they thought about that. They have different languages. They have different traditions. They see themselves as entirely different history, looking more to Byzantium than to the Mongol Empire of the past, and they see Russia as entirely different. They understood very well that that Putin and the Russians had poisoned the Russian Orthodox Church, and so they split away and started the Ukrainian Orthodox Church because they didn't want to be influenced by the religious aspects and the poisoning of that religion. And so there's a combination of coming together. While I was there, I visited several of the cabinet ministers, and I was struck by a statue that's out on the sidewalk in Kyiv. It's St. George and the Dragon, which is the symbol of Ukraine. And when you look at it, there's St. George. Guess who the dragon is? Well, they know who the dragon is, and it's Russia, and it's part of their culture. Now, there's some discussion about whether or not the Russians, as their goal, can destroy the Ukrainian will to fight. I don't think they can destroy the Ukrainian will to fight. Every cabinet minister I met with, and Herman, I think we met with about 12, all of them said the same thing, and it was that they would fight to the end because they really don't have any choice, do they? They know very well what happens when the Russians take over Ukraine. And Applebaum wrote a whole book about this called Red Famine, which I would encourage you all to read. They know they don't have any choice, and the will to fight is very strong. But I caution you that if you look at the American Civil War, it is possible to destroy the will to fight if you're determined enough to do it. And nobody here should think I'm an unreconstructed Southerner. I'm not. I've served my country well, I think, the entire United States. But if you look back at the American Civil War, Grant and Sherman decided to destroy the Southern will to fight. And they marched all the way to Atlanta, destroying everything that they could. And it went a long way towards Appomattox. So that can happen, and we should be thoughtful about that. But nonetheless, the atrocities, war crimes, stealing of children, attacks on civilians, all of that, and this weird desire to reinstate the old Russian Empire by Peter the Great and so on. All of that is consolidating all of the various tensions that you're talking about with this panel into one consolidated Ukraine to fight against this unified enemy that they have. The United States, in my view, has a stake in this. And I will say that what we need to focus on is the world of the 21st century. The reason that this is important is because the question is going to be, what kind of world are we going to live in the 21st century? Is it going to be, as was said in an earlier panel, a world where the people are taken away at night and put into the basement and shot in the head with no, or are we going to have our values that are going to be in control? And that really is what this is about. So I'm going to close pretty quickly here by saying a couple of things. When the time comes to give a grade, I want to do two things. I want to give a grade on Ukrainian unity and resolve and resilience. And that is reflected by everything that we've seen on the battlefield. Herman's group took me out onto the battlefield, and we went down into Mariupol and saw all of that before the invasion in 22. The Ukrainian resolve is remarkable. And I don't believe it's going anywhere. I think that they're going to do exactly what they told me they were going to do. But I'm going to also give a grade on messaging. And that is that as a politician, I think I understand the role of messaging. It's a key element of hybrid warfare. You have to say what you're going to do and why you're going to do it so that people will believe you. You can't just say what you're going to do, but you have to explain why you're doing it. And I would say to you that this war can't be just about Ukraine. It can't be just about Ukraine. If it's just about Ukraine alone, then you will lose America's population and public in support of Ukraine. And that is the discussion that is going on right now. And messaging is very key. Negotiation, in my judgment, is overrated. You're not going to have a negotiation that's going to solve anything as long as the national will of the Ukrainians and the Russians is entirely different from each other. I agree with Kyle Parker when he said that we should never legitimate any of the Russian conquests. There's no history of saying that we should do that. Even during the time of the Soviet times, we had captive nations. We never agreed that those captive nations were conquered and a part of the Soviet Union as a conquest. So the question is going to be a matter, in my view, of resolve, both of Russia and of the United States. And what we're seeing right now is a compilation and of all of the ethnic challenges or difficulties or religious divisions that might have occurred that have disappeared because of the Russian war crimes and aggression and attacks. And as long as we remember those things and remember that it's all politics, we're going to ultimately end up winning this war, Ambassador.
That was eloquent and a great, great example of why you need to send people to the OSCE to learn about American interests. Okay, Ilan. They want to hear what you say before they turn on. Yeah, it's this one.
That's perfect. That's fine. That's fine.
I'm impatient. So, so first of all, thank you. Thank you, Walter and Mick and Andre and all the organizers, because I do a lot of work on Iran and the Middle East. And so this is an opportunity to spend like an hour and a half not doing that. So I really appreciate it. No. So let me start by this. I actually want to start where the governor ended and talk and drill down specifically on messaging. And for those of you that know me, you know that my role many times is that of a professional skunk at the garden party. So I have to say that in my view, the grade is mixed on messaging. And because the way I see it, messaging is not just messaging about the stakes and the conflict. It's really what we're talking about is a war of narratives. A war of narratives that's taking place in the current conflict. It's about Ukrainian identity. And it revolves around two central questions, right? What is Ukraine telling itself? And what is Ukraine telling the world? And here, I have to say that, you know, the picture in the information sphere is mixed. It's a decent grade, but it's worse than you would expect, particularly given the stakes, particularly given the contours of the conflict and the existential nature of the fight. So let me break it down for you guys just in three categories: the good, the not so good, and the bad, right? The good is that Ukraine has, by necessity, developed a comprehensive, multi-layered counter-disinformation and information warfare strategy. What it has is it has specialized agencies in various ministries, in the culture ministry and the information ministry, centers like the International Center for Combating Disinformation, the Center for Strategic Information Security, and others that serve as quarterbacks for this general fight. It also has an information space monitoring component at the National Security and Defense Council, which is very important to watch for the intrusion of disinformation narratives into the Ukrainian media ecosystem. It also has civil society initiatives, ranging from grassroots fact-checking to a plethora of think tanks and NGOs that are actively working in the disinfo space. And there's also a government push to increase media literacy, which is taking a page from the Finnish playbook, which has been proven to be very, very effective. And countries that have not invested in media literacy have fallen behind in terms of their resilience with regard to Russian disinformation. So this is a very positive step. It also has very robust counter messaging in the digital space. You guys all know this. I'm told I'm a Luddite because I'm not on Telegram, but apparently Ukraine has a very robust presence on Telegram. It certainly has a robust presence on Twitter and on various platforms where it is possible to be nimble, to be agile, and to very rapidly debunk false narratives. So that's the good, and it is good. The not so good is that Ukraine still has limited international outreach. There was a time when Ukrainian officials would spend a lot of time here in Washington talking about disinformation, talking about Russian hybrid warfare, talking about information manipulation, and that has fallen away. Part of that is a function of politics, right? The political cycle we're in now, but not all of it. Ukraine has, I'm seeing alarming signs that Ukraine has deprioritized this fight as it's worried about the battlefront. And that's very natural, but it also may be the leading edge of an ominous trend, because the second problem is that information warfare in Ukraine does not have a discrete budget. The numbers vary, right? Ukraine doesn't publicize its expenditures on information warfare or counter disinformation in a standalone budget line. The IO fight is embedded in broader defense, security, and infrastructure security budgets, right? And we know what that is. The total security and defense budget that was announced for this year is 2.2 trillion hryvnia, right? So that's 53.5 roughly $billion. And we assume that disinformation work is getting a significant amount of money, but we don't know. And there's a danger because it's not isolated from the vagaries of other line item expenditures, that when Ukraine runs into trouble on the military and defense industrial production line, money will be diverted from this fight to pay for more pressing things. That's a very natural thing, but it's also a potentially very dangerous thing. So that's the not so good. The risk, I would say that's probably the largest not so good. Because there's no breakout, there's a risk that it's underfunded, that it's overlooked, and that it's essentially superseded. Okay, and here's the bad. The bad is that the enemy, and by the enemy I mean Russia in this context, is adapting. Russia is showing a significant evolution in the way it does information operations and disinformation, right? It's using AI, it's using botnets, it's doing all sorts of things that are challenging for people who are paying attention to this all the time to get ahead. And Ukraine is not, I would argue, paying attention to it as much as it should. Ukraine is also not telling its story in the way that the governor was talking about, not explaining, not setting the Ukraine fight in the larger context of Russian strategic culture, Russian imperialism, the connectivity between Russia and China and Iran, that narrative isn't being told. And I would argue that because that narrative isn't being told, that's at least part of the reason for it, for some people call it uncharitably now, for some people to have Ukraine fatigue, right? Because quite simply, Ukraine has not explained properly what the real stakes are in this fight. And then there's the question of Ukraine's own domestic messaging. And I would argue charitably that Ukraine's domestic messaging leaves a lot to be desired. You have and we're talking here about Ukraine 24, you have very modest market share for the channel and for its parent company. You have, based on polling, you have limited popular trust among the Ukrainian people in its independence because the Ukrainian media sphere has been traditionally oligarch dominated and it hasn't been fully reformed yet. And also because there is a propensity to simply parrot official talking lines without spending more time on sort of unifying themes, right? And the last thing, and I think this is arguably the most important thing, is that Ukraine is facing a lean season in the funding of disinformation. And what I mean by this is at the American Foreign Policy Council, a couple of years ago, I did this study looking at Western responses to Russian disinformation. And I spent a lot of time in the Baltics, in the Nordic states, and in Eastern Europe. And the common thread throughout was that every country, there was no unified ecosystem. Every country was building a response in their own way. But the countries that were doing the best were the ones that were focusing on things like media literacy, but also the ones that were fully funded. And in conversation after conversation in places like Prague and Tallinn, I heard the same thing. Thank goodness for the US government because they're supporting our counter disinformation effort. This was, and those of you that have sort of followed this issue, you know, the Global Engagement Center at the State Department, which no longer exists, it lost its mandate. But the GEC had as one of its primary objectives, primary tasks, to be the funder of first resort for initiatives like this all across the post-Soviet space. My caution to them, which they dismissed out of hand back in 2023, was envision, if you will, a more austere fiscal environment, have your governments fully fund this enterprise so you're not so dependent on American dollars. And they dismissed this out of hand because they never thought a day would come where the US was investing less in this. And yet we are, right? The last 6 months have shown that we are. I have hope that we are going to see at least a partial U-turn and a turnaround and recapitalizing of some of our assets, like Voice of America, like Radio Free Europe. But I don't think it's in the cards for us to really become a first-order investor in European counter-disinformation anytime soon. And that means that the burden of doing this and doing this properly falls on the constituent governments themselves. And Ukraine is the front line of defense because Ukraine is the laboratory where these information narratives, these false tropes are being tested and being propagated outward from there. So if Ukraine does not take this as seriously as it should, does not invest more than it is currently, we're all going to have a lot of problems. So I'm sorry, that's a very glass half empty view, but I think it's a fairly realistic view. I have to say, if I had to give a grade, again, we're not on a standard grading schedule. So I did a letter grade. So my letter grade was, it was a B-. As my grade school teacher would say when she would send marks like that home to my parents, there is room for improvement. So there you have
it. Which one are we using? Here, I'll take this one over here.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you for that. I'm still trying to figure out why I'm on this panel, but maybe we'll get to that point. Again, Thomas Lang, I'm a businessman. I guess that's what drove me to start to want to figure out how I could help. I'm married to an incredible Ukrainian lady and have 3 kids. So it's very personal to me. My background is construction materials, and I was trying to figure out how I could help. And if anybody told me at this stage in my life, I'd be sitting around this cast of characters. I wouldn't have believed it. This incredible people that want to help. 3 or 4 months ago, I sat in a meeting with the Ukraine Defense Department's SSTS, which is their equivalent to the American Corps of Engineers. So I was with General Yakovitz. I was with General John Lloyd, who's the commander of the North Atlantic U.S. ACE. And they both turned to me at the end of the meeting and said, please help us. And, that's humbling to think of where my life has brought me to now. So let me try to, I was listening to all the speakers speak today, and I want to start with this. The reconstruction program has a chance to do 2 things in Ukraine. It could make it worse, or it could make it better. The reconstruction process, if it's managed properly, I think has the opportunity to make the biggest social change that Ukraine has ever had happen to it in the last 25 years. And I've been going to Ukraine for 30 years. I ran a company in Poland. I saw what it took in the 90s from Poland to transform itself from the post-Soviet economy into an integrated economy. And that took 10 years when I left in 2002. So that's, where I'll just sort of put that in a ball, and I'll pack it and leave it there. To talk about the veterans and to talk about workforce development and the project management information system. So let's go to the first slide. Good. Or the next one. All right. So what needs to happen now, in our opinion? Plan and educate the workforce, identify and evaluate what needs to be repaired, what needs to be fixed, identify and evaluate what kind of a workforce that we have in Ukraine, increase the numbers of highly qualified Ukrainian planning and architect and engineering companies, and develop the capacity in environmental sustainability and resiliency under the European Union guidelines. Next. And next. So who's going to do it? As I said, in Poland, I watched the academia and the public and private sector. It took almost 7, 8, let's just say the better part of 10 years for those 3 systems to integrate themselves, where they could issue a contract and have it built and managed according to Western standards. So, you have to develop the human capital to do that. Just a couple of add-ons there. The government, national, the oblast, the regional, the city, all those levels of government have to get integrated into one building code system. If I can work in Kiev, can I work in Dnipropetrovsk? If I want to go to Kharkiv, can I work in another city? You have to have the same standards. Then, you have the supplemental transportation and telecommunication consultancies that are going to have to be assisting these organizations. Next slide. So who and how? I'm just going to focus really on 2 main things right now. The workforce and digital technology. Until those 2 things get in sync, the reconstruction is just going to stutter and stutter and stammer and stutter and go very slowly. Today, to manage projects, billion-dollar projects, it's all done digitally. You can't handle the complications of work orders, of supply chains without integrating these things. And then the government policy on contract law, contract licensing, and permitting. I mean, that's a whole nother world. I could have a discussion on that for the next 5 hours, but that is just something that has to be addressed. And it's going to be a tough process. So next slide. So when? Walter, you've been hearing me speak for 3 years now. You can't start education soon enough. I mean, the education takes anywhere from 4 to 5 years to properly train engineers and architects and city planners and designers. So it's a process that during our education, during my evaluation of the system over the last 3 years, we're now narrowing in on one area to focus on, and I'll get to that in a minute. So, you know, the building materials industry, what quality, what capacity to have. And then the next thing, technology must be in place, and then certified programs integrating all that together. Next slide. So in my humble opinion, it's basically a 4-phase project. For the first 18 months after the war, you're going to deal with what you have. What you have is what you got. You're going to have to build to sustain the population, help it to get to the next level. About 2 years later, you'll start having the first projects being built that's being engineered. And then, you know, in years 4, finally, you'll have a new educated workforce that'll be able to integrate projects that have taken a couple of years to design. You want to build a new concrete plant today, it takes you a year just to get the equipment. You know, so things don't happen quickly. And then after year 4, I see an integrated educational system with industry, and that's doing it at twice the pace that Poland did it. Next one. So what is digital construction? Digital construction is project management information systems. You can't build a highway in the United States without having a PMIS system in place. You can't get paid, you can't order materials, you can't have an inspector come out if you're not tied into a system. Once you're tied into that, the money going into Ukraine, if it's tied to PMIS systems, will generate change. It has to, because it's just, you won't get paid if you don't fill into the system. It checks quality, it checks what was designed, was it built, and it holds people to the dollars spent. You know when the dollars are being spent. So, you know, without digital management, cost overruns you can't control, things take longer, and productivity lags. So that gets me to the next slide. In productivity, digital technology reduces the amount of management workforce, and that's going to be critical in Ukraine. It's critical in America. You can't get enough managers that can handle the digital technology today. So the training in project management is a big part of our program right now. So digital technology, that's an incredible slide developed by the Trimble company. And then the last one. So what digital construction does is creates transparency, it creates visibility, predictability, and it controls the outcome. In those things, that answers to me what so many of us hear about corruption in Ukraine. To me, it's just a hangover of the Soviet system. It's the single payer system. Nobody's accountable. Nobody's checking on what was designed was built. Once you put these systems in place, so that's small investment in PMIS systems and a small investment in training project managers. Our organization, we're laser focused on these programs now, trying to assist legislators and trying to get legislation for it and the money that's going to be coming to Ukraine, and trying to work with the Ukrainian SSTS to put the Army Corps of Engineers has asked us to help build capacity in that organization. And for the first time, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is publicizing that they want us to do it. It's not behind. So, you know, I want to wrap up with this. PMIS systems, it attacks the root cause of corruption in Ukraine. And that in its change can make a very significant change in the country and help the construction industry change the direction. So I'm told to wrap it up. Walter, I hope that qualifies me for October. There you go. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Also within the time. So we're going to be able to get us on time. I see we have someone who has their hand raised. You have a question? Before we read the questions, we're going to do the grading. Now, Kateryna already gave a grade, 70 to 80%. And Ilan also gave a B-, which I think falls in that 70 to 80% range. Governor Gilmore, do you want to give a grade?
Yeah, you'd almost think Ilan and I conspired on this, but we didn't. I want to give a grade to the Ukrainians with respect to their resilience and resolve, their sacrifice for what they're trying to do. And if 5 is the best and 1 is the worst, I'd give them a 5. Now, on the issue of messaging, which I think is the most important element of national power, the most important thing. By the way, I would, based on everything I've said, I'd give the Russians a 4 because they've almost turned America around, but not entirely. So I'd give them a 4 rather than a 5. But as for the Ukrainians, 5 being the best, 1 being the worst, I would give them a -3.
Thomas.
Yeah, on the subject of resiliency, working with my Ukrainian partners and our Ukrainian staff, I give them a 10. They're incredible. I'm just humbled at talking to my partners and my associates who are from bomb shelters. I have a family that runs downstairs at night while the missiles were coming in overhead. So I mean, I just, who am I? I get to live this life I live. So, you know, a 5. As far as messaging, I give it about 3.
Thank you. I go with those who say resilience, it's clearly a 5 or an A or a 99%, whichever your grading system is. On messaging, I think 3 is more accurate. I disagree with the governor, which is not too often. Because really the problem is not so much what Ukraine is conveying, it's what's happening in the United States. And in fact, Biden kind of understood that Russia was a danger to the United States, but frankly, he didn't have the gumption to state it clearly because certain policies would flow from that. And the current administration doesn't seem to understand that Russia is a threat to the United States, and that's its own problem. And the Russians have gotten into our information space, a very complicated story, which I will not bore you with. Okay, now questions. Okay, yes, she already, I quoted her at the beginning. Okay, question. She was in the 70 to 80%. A B minus could get you to like an 80 or an 81. Yeah, okay. All right. Yeah, okay, over there in the back.
Well, as the governor already said, we are there is almost nearly on every continent, and in the past 2 world, Ukraine, primary front of the most of the conflict is going on today in the. So as we are approaching this worldwide conflict and tying this into the messaging, do you think
Please,
part
just
of
a question?
Yes,
no throat clearing anymore. Just a question.
But as we are approaching this worldwide war, do you think part of the reason we are not in a world war is part of the messaging, or because we have not officially fallen into a world war with our adversary?
Is that to me? You've asked me why we're not in a world war. Yeah, we're in a world war. We're in a world war now. We're at war with a combination of countries that have a vision for the 21st century, which puzzles me. I just think in the modern world, you can't keep control of people the way they think they can, but they think they can, and they've demonstrated it in North Korea. And China is controlling people through the use of information and high technology and AI and everything like that. So they think they can do it. But the Russians are a lot more crude. They just depend upon the basement with the bullet in the back of the head, and the example of Navalny being murdered in the Arctic Circle. So, you know, they think they can do it, but they have a vision for the 21st century that is contrary to our values. That is the war that we are in, and it is a hybrid war. And I've often said, well, thank goodness we're not in a shooting war, except we are. So that's the best answer I can give.
Going twice? Okay. Oh, okay. Last question, please.
Thank you. Ambassador Herbst, since nobody has a Ukraine question, I just have to ask, can you summarize your last intriguing remark that the Russians are really in our information space? What's new? We know they're in, but what's new?
What's we need in the information space. Oh, well, yeah, I mean, it starts with, it starts and ends with divisions in American society. The Russians have gotten into our information space in the past, especially during the Cold War. Their entree was almost entirely on the left side of our political spectrum. Naifs on the left side. In this period, their gains have been overwhelmingly, but not entirely, on the right. And there are at least 2 or 3 large reasons for this. First, we fought wars in the greater Middle East, which did not prove to be successful. And there was never a reckoning with that in elite American political culture. Unlike, for example, after the Vietnam War, when there was a reckoning. And that created an isolationist strand, or it appealed to isolationist instincts, principally on the right, although a little bit on the left. But more important than that is the fact that you might say the mainstream media, the foreign policy elites, which according to people in portions of the right conducted inadequate policies in the greater Middle East, lined up in support of Ukraine. And those elites are despised by the MAGA movement. And then the third reason is very particular, but it may ultimately be the most important. The way Ukraine as an issue factored into our politics with the impeachment of Donald Trump. So that made a lot of people who knew nothing about foreign policy antagonistic to Ukraine. I can't think of one foreign policy leader in America's history, one foreign leader in America's history who had the complications dealing with the United States that Zelensky had since he became president in 2019 until this present day. Although if you appreciate irony, which you're forced to when you're dealing with tragic circumstances, you know that Poroshenko is part of the reason for Zelensky's problems coming from the very beginning of his term. And if you want, I can explain that, but that will be not from this podium because we should move on to the next part of the group.
Did something we missed her part, and that was on the Russian Orthodox Church. That was the one, and that's the one place that I would have wanted to hear from what she had to say, because it's something that I did talk to Ambassador Gilmore about and others, and that is that the religious part actually influenced us even on the ultra right as well, because there were people who were lying. And the Russian Orthodox Church was actually expressing that they were lying about us persecuting Christian Protestants in Ukraine. And that was a whole new kettle of fish that I don't really want to open up, but I would have wanted to hear.
Look, you're the one running the railroad. So you want to ask Kateryna to answer that question? No,
What do you think? And Pani Kateryna, can you do that in about a minute or two on the religion?
Can you just repeat the question because I didn't hear from the mic?
On the role of the Russian Orthodox Church, you had said that in some ways, when it eventually identified itself, it wasn't impactful on social cohesion because it identified itself outside of the other religious confessions in Ukraine, including Islam and Judaism and stuff like that. So it sort of cited itself. Has that been done in Ukraine, where the Russian Orthodox Church doesn't have as much of an impact on social cohesion as it might have had earlier?
Well, what I meant was that this is the reasons for putting Russian Orthodox Church in a separate legal standing and a category, basically associating it with Russia, which is claimed to be a terrorist state in Ukraine's legislation, is basically its strong association with Russian state, as we know, in Russia itself. So basically, to a degree, it is viewed as an agent of a foreign government, which is an aggressive state to Ukraine, the Russian Federation. To this degree, it is not seen as part of a religious landscape, but it is seen more as a part of, foreign subversive effort. There is an organic, it's a very long conversation, to what degree the organic parishes of Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine basically participate in subversive efforts of Moscow's basically church, and this is a whole different conversation. But just to say that from the point of view of social cohesion and the social consensus, that all religious denominations work together for the sake of Ukraine's victory. I would say that when it comes to organic religious movements, it is sort of an existential survivalist-oriented consensus. And when it comes to this particular special status of separate status of Moscow Church, it is specifically to the degree that it is external and alien to Ukraine's organic religious landscape, if that makes sense.
Walter, if you want, I could talk about this issue here in the United States. The Kremlin tried with limited success, not zero success, but limited success, to push the theme that Zelensky was oppressing ethnic Russians and Moscow Patriarchate Russian Orthodox believers in Ukraine.
Right.
They hired a fancy pants lawyer to lobby on the Hill.
Yep.
And they were picked up by people with great passion, bad intentions, and severe ignorance. And I'm thinking specifically of Tucker Carlson and Laura Ingraham.
Yeah.
And they made some small inroads in heavy MAGA information space with this. There was one problem, though, with this effort. It was based upon a very thin amount of evidence. Now, point of fact, I believe that the Rada and the Zelensky administration made a mistake when they took specific steps against the Moscow Patriarchate, because they could have dealt with the problem just through existing laws, but they did that. And that was a mistake, and it could be counted against them in the people who look at religious freedom. The only problem with this effort, though, was that, in fact, the Moscow Patriarchate is an instrument of Russian national security policy. We all know that the Patriarch is an FSB agent. He has his own name. I forget what it is. We all know that they have worked against tolerance within Ukrainian society. I mentioned that there's serious tolerance going on in Ukraine across confessional divides, and the MP Moscow Patriarch never shows up there. And most importantly, the great repression religiously in Ukraine is taking place in Russian-occupied Ukraine. And there have been a remarkable number of Ukrainian activists and one American Republican, Stephen Moore, who's in Ukraine, working on this issue. And they produced reams of information letting the world know that the Russians have destroyed 535 churches. They have murdered 30 plus pastors, principally Protestants. They have tortured hundreds of religious figures, primarily Protestants, and they have brought this message to the United States. There's a wonderful film which I saw 4 weeks ago, whose name I've forgotten. As I get older, my memory is not as good as it used to be. But Google it, Russian repression in Ukraine, you'll find that film.
It's Face Under Siege. Sorry, Face Under Siege.
Very much. Produced by an evangelical in Colorado. And this message has gotten out, including into MAGA circles. Newsmax is excellent on the subject. Fox is excellent on the subject. And I can tell you a little contribution I've made. When the fancy pants lawyer arrived for Hill consultations 2 years ago, 2+ years ago, we had the Hill completely wired on all the nasty things that the Russians were doing against especially American evangelicals. And he had a very rude reception. Polite, but substantively rude. Real hero here is Pavlo Ungarian, a former member of the Rada, a very, very active evangelical who has great contacts in this country, which he's developed over 20 years. And the whole prayer breakfast thing, which of course has been an American tradition for many decades, has been a Ukrainian tradition for 10+ years, and Ungarian is the principal man behind that. And Zelensky is now hosting one later this summer in Ukraine, and I'll be there.
I just read yes, this was an important part of that social cohesion. So sorry, I intervened that way.
No, you're the boss. Sorry?
Mikhailo is the agent name for.
Oh, Tujajaku.
I'm very sorry, Herman. Now I put you in the situation. I'm really sorry about this. It was just such a good panel. I guess I didn't want to let him go. Janusz, you're here. Alex is online. Kirichenko is online, and I think Mr. Babenko, who's going to take, Mr. Babenko is here as well. Okay. Herman, you did get Mr. Babenko's bio, yes? Okay, sir. So I would ask everybody to sit down because we've got the final panel. The final panel is on national identity. As I promised you, it's all aces till the very end. And so this last panel has as many aces as all the other panels had. So Herman, please, it's all yours.
Okay. All right. First, Walter, thanks again to you and your team for putting it together. It's hard to believe this is the 13th year American Foreign Policy Council has been involved in helping you. And of course, our cooperation goes back many years before that. And if there's one constant about these conferences is I've never been to one where I haven't learned some things. There's so many people that are knowledgeable in their areas. I think we all do a measure of educating each other. Now, I know the time is very tight. We have a hard stop of being out of this room completely at 5:30. It's part of the contract with the university club that has other functions they have to set up for. So I'm going to do abbreviated introductions, and we'll do them one at a time. One of the problems we have is certainly Alex and Janusz could talk for an hour themselves and keep us very interested. And though I know David and Volodymyr only by reputation, they probably could talk for an hour too. But let me begin with Janusz, who's next to me. He is the author of 21 books and what? Now up to 23. Well, you have to keep your eye on Janusz. The books keep cranking out. Probably the most discussed in recent years has been Failed State, a Guide to Russia's Rupture. And I think with that, I'll just turn it over to Janusz to give him maximum time to talk. You have to speak close to it or it doesn't pick up yet. Really close, like 2 inches. Yeah.
Yeah, can you hear me now? Maybe it's not on. I don't want to swallow it. Can you hear me now? Yes, you can. I could even hear myself there. Okay. Okay, thank you, Herman. I'm going to be not too long, certainly not an hour. Let me just start by saying this. I love sitting on Walter's panels. I'm usually on this panel or the disinformation panel. But let me say one thing. I'm looking forward to the time where we no longer have to assess the unity and strength of Ukrainian national identity. And maybe I would say that time is already here. Ukrainian identity, I would say, has not only been forged through war, but through persistent Russian repression that has failed clearly to murder or assimilate the majority of Ukrainians. All societies and nations, of course, have divisions or distinctions based on region, religion, ethnicity, class, ideology, and so forth. And people may claim several identities and still be loyal to the state and to national unity, especially in the face of a war of annihilation that Ukraine is now experiencing. During this war, I would say Ukraine is probably the most united society in Europe and the West in general. This is evident in overwhelming support for actively resisting Russian imperialism and comprehensive unwillingness to surrender. It's also worth remembering, by the way, that a strong national identity does not guarantee national unity on all questions. Just look at neighboring Poland and the deep divisions in that society and other societies bordering Ukraine, not to mention Western Europe, not to mention the United States. Okay, as the only non-Ukrainian on this panel other than Herman, my fellow speakers have a much better sense of what it means to be Ukrainian and to feel a sense of loyalty and commitment to your nation and state. But I do know that Ukraine in this war has been experiencing unprecedented linguistic rebirth, historical rediscovery, and national re-identification in a process of long overdue de-Russification. And I'm going to limit my observations to the challenges that Ukraine still confronts in the acceptance of its national unity, distinctiveness, and independence on the world stage, not so much domestic, because I think this is a subject that needs to be much more thoroughly covered. So let me outline three narratives internationally. First, Moscow seeks to convince naive Westerners that Ukraine is simply an offshoot of Russia and therefore has no right to independence. In fact, it is astonishing how many politicians and commentators continue to parrot fake history concocted by Moscow. We must be clear and persistent through all available means, all available channels, to explain that one, Ukrainian identity and the Confederation of Kievan Ruthenia is centuries older than that of a small and largely insignificant Slavic tribe in the Moscow region. Two, the Muscovite Tsars appropriated the Rus ethnonym from medieval Kiev to claim its heritage and to control all East Slavonic peoples. Three, since the 15th century, Moscovia, under various names, has been an expanding colonial empire that murders, deports, or forcibly assimilates its neighbors, seizes their land, and eradicates their identity. And four, Ukrainians have been the primary victims of Moscow precisely because of their stubborn resistance to Russification. Without stolen Ukrainian history, culture, and religion, Russia becomes a largely hollow shell. Second, the Kremlin tries to convince Western governments that Ukraine threatens Russia because it wants security through NATO membership. This is a blatant lie. It's not even disinformation, it's a lie. No NATO country bordering Russia threatens its security or its statehood. In fact, the most stable borders in Europe are between NATO and Russia. To put it simply and clearly, NATO is not a threat to Russia. It helps to neutralize the Russia threat. And third, the Kremlin projects all of its internal failures onto Ukraine
in order to convince the West that Ukraine is the problem, not Russia, and therefore it should not be supported by Western governments. Let me mention three. One, the government in Kiev is illegitimate because it has not held recent elections. Where have we heard this? This is designed to disguise the fact that, unlike in Ukraine, Russia's elections are always forged, and Putin is not a legitimate head of state in any democratic sense, any stretch of pluralism or democracy. Two, we've heard a little bit about this on the previous panel. Two, Kiev represses minorities, the Russian language, and religion. In reality, Ukraine respects minority rights, does not ban Russian, the Russian language, and permits any religion, even what I call the death cult, posing as the Russian Orthodox Church, on its territory. In stark contrast, Russia colonizes its minorities, exploits their resources, does not allow for the teaching of Ukrainian, imposes language laws that restrict the use of indigenous non-Ruski languages throughout the federation, and bans several religions that try to remain free of state control, including Jehovah's Witnesses is a very good example. And three, Ukraine, this is the narrative that one has to watch out for. Three, Ukraine is losing the war and has no cards left to play. Where did we hear that? The reality is the opposite. Russia's military losses are proportionately much greater than Ukraine's. Russian forces have been unable to capture any major Ukrainian city. Russia's Black Sea Fleet can no longer operate, and Ukraine is able to strike any military or energy target inside Russia. In addition, Ukraine has been strengthened by new weapons from the West, and which should be actually underscored even more, through domestic production, while Russia's resources are shrinking. I don't want to go into all the problems Russia faces, but those are the realities. In addition to spreading the facts about their nation and state, Ukrainians must turn the tables on Kremlin disinformation by helping to educate the West about the weaknesses of the Russian state. And in this vein, it's always good to promote oneself. I have just published, number 24, I just published a new edited anthology to convey the message that Russia is a failed state that must be decolonized, and that there are viable alternatives to the current empire. The title is Free Nations, New States, The End Stage of Russian Colonialism, just published in London. I will be presenting the anthology actually in Kiev in a couple of weeks, one of the commissions of the Verkhovna Rada. And the link, if I only have one copy, they're very heavy, so I only brought one copy. It's actually a compilation of 14 fora that we've had called the Free Nations of Post-Russia Fora that we've held in the various capitals from Tokyo and Taipei to Washington and Ottawa. Warsaw, of course, is where it began. And it's available, the link is available on the Jamestown website, and it's my new project on Promethean liberation. So I'll stop there. I've given Walter a copy. I've got one person I want to give this copy to.
Thanks, Yanis.
That's all for now.
Your recitation of Russian hypocritical statements calls to mind the statement of Beadle Smith, who was our first CIA director, but before that served as ambassador to the Soviet Union 47 to 1950. And he said in his in this book, My Years in Russia or Soviet Union, Russia is always, meaning the Soviets, are always blaming others for what they themselves are doing or intend to do. And there you have the details. I think next we'll go to Alexander Motyl, who's a professor at Rutgers. He's regularly rated as one of the top political science professors in the United States, and has written, as Yanis, many books. One I remember especially is Decay, Collapse, and the Revival of Empires. Alexander, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. After listening to Janusz's brilliant presentation, I could actually end mine by simply saying I agree with everything he said. But that would seem to be, a bit excessive and sycophantic, so I'll make a few comments. But essentially, I do agree with everything he said, but I'd like to focus perhaps a little more on internal developments rather than the external focus he developed. And I'd like to stick to the questions that we were asked to evaluate. So the first two are, is there a sense of a common past? Is there a sense of a common future? And picking up on what Janusz was saying, I'd like to suggest that the reason why there is indeed increasingly a sense of a common past and a sense of a common future is precisely because there is more than the sense, there is the lived experience of a common present. And that common present, as Janusz said, is of course the war, a brutal genocidal war, unprovoked, initiated by Russia, whose intent is the destruction of the Ukrainian state and the Ukrainian nation. Given that kind of shared experience, it's not surprising that many Ukrainians, regardless of political affiliations, regardless of language preference or territorial allegiance, have indeed developed an increasingly common view of themselves as Ukrainians with a common past and a common future. It was Charles Tilly, the late sociologist, who said, states are war makers and wars are state makers. I would simply change that a bit by suggesting that wars are nation builders as well. And we see that in the way, again, at least within the discussions taking place amongst intellectuals, historians, people like that, analysts who regularly write columns for the various websites. There is, in fact, as a growing sense, or perhaps even a full sense, of the fact that Ukraine has a long history going back to the Kievan Rus state. This is not a new interpretation of Ukrainian history. It's been championed by Ukrainians in Ukraine and the diaspora for many decades, but it seems to be achieving something resembling a hegemonic status is too strong, but certainly a kind of taken for granted status. We see the public opinion surveys conducted by the Kiev Institute of International Sociology, the questions they ask regarding your homeland, sovereignty of Ukraine, whom do you associate with, which language do you speak, which languages do you speak at home, at work. And unsurprisingly, over the last 3 years, all of those indices, which are indirect, they're not immediate related to identity, but they're obviously of importance in determining identity. All of these indices have been moving in the identity direction. And again, it's not surprising precisely because there is a war going on and that war will continue. And as long as the war continues, excuse me, that sense of identity will presumably grow. So I would, in providing grades for common past, common future, I'd be inclined to say something somewhere between a 4 and a 5, possibly. I'm tempted to give both categories a 5, but at the same time, I do know that there are debates, there is disagreement. So perhaps 4.5 would be an appropriate grade. Is Ukraine successfully creating unity out of plurality? Thus far, yes. Again, largely as a result of the war. Wars have a tendency to bring people together. And I would highlight the relationship primarily between ethnic Ukrainians, regardless of language preference, and Jewish Ukrainians, or Ukrainian Jews, if you will. There has been a checkered past, as you all know. but there's been a rallying around the flag, an increasing identification on the part of Ukrainian Jews with Ukraine, and an increasing willingness on the part of ethnic Ukrainians to ask uncomfortable questions about their own past, their own history. I would suggest that similar developments are taking place with regard to Polish-Ukrainian relations. There too, there's a checkered past, but there are discussions, there are efforts being made by both sides to find some kind of common ground. So I'd be inclined to give Ukraine a 4 out of the unity of plurality business. In terms of overcoming the devastating effects of war, my impression is that the last panel discussed that question with regard to resilience. Everybody gave Ukraine high marks, and I'll give Ukraine number 5 as well. So much for the good news. Let me just focus very briefly on what I think is a possible source of concern with regard to a common national identity. And I'll begin with a quotation that I'm going to misquote by Rupert Emerson, who wrote From Empire to Nation many, many years ago. And he defined nations as roughly, again, I'm repeating probably with some incorrect focus, but he defined nation as that unit of human community for which people would be willing to die, to fight in the army and die. And if that's the criterion of national identity, then I think Ukraine, as a rule, gets high marks. There's no question about the fact that the volunteers, the conscripts, have been putting up a very impressive struggle over the last 3.5 years. At the same time, we do know that there are tens of thousands of deserters and draft dodgers. Again, far be it from me to preach to people as to how they should behave at a time of war. I was lucky to have escaped the draft and have no idea how I would have responded had I been drafted during the Vietnam War. But the fact that so many Ukrainian men are not willing to join the fight suggests that their relationship with the nation is perhaps a bit more tenuous than we'd like to think. It's unclear. One would need to talk to people, and one would need to conduct research, conversations to be able to determine what exactly they have in mind. But just the mere fact of so many deserters and draft dodgers suggests that there is at least some degree of reticence about the national identity. That said, if this were a category that should be getting a grade, I'd still give Ukraine a 4, 4.5, possibly even a 5. And on that, I think I'll end my presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Deserters and drafted dodgers are, of course, not pleasant to think about, but I can't think of any war in any history, in any side, in any war in any history that didn't have some measure of that. So while not liking it, it should be put into to context, I think. And I didn't mention the many op-eds that Alexander has written over the years that have given fuel to people that have been involved in the day-to-day debate here in Washington. We'll now go to Pavlo Babenko. He's a Ukrainian volunteer, civic leader, and chief operating officer of the Modern Ukraine Foundation. It's a foundation dedicated to systematic change, connecting urgent aid with also a long-term vision for Ukraine's future. And Pavlo's new to me, but I look forward to learning more about what he's doing and his thoughts on the topic.
Thanks for such introduction. Okay, what if I told you that the future of Europe isn't being written in Brussels or Berlin, but in small town across Ukraine, in community centers, basements turned in innovation labs, and war-scared schools reborn as a beacon of hope? What if I told you that every act of support today, every drone, every mural, every VR headset for a child isn't just in aid, it's in infrastructure. Helping today means building tomorrow. And for a future, we are building with our own hands. And my name is Pavlo Babenko, and I represent Modern Ukraine Foundation and team of thinkers and doers who are reshaping what it means to be a country at war and a country of the future. Since 2022, our foundation has delivered more than like $6 million in aid to defense forces, medical units, communities, people, and frontline responders. Like many, we also delivered aid, protective gears, heat, and food as well. But soon we realized that survival is not enough. And that's why we are building now a post-war strategy starting now. Our defenders, they don't fight just for right to exist. They fight for the right to imagine, to build, to innovate, to create, to dream. And so we ask ourselves, what if our mission was not only to support the front, but to shape the front line of the future? And this is how our concept of spaces of tomorrow was born. This is now our new national-wide initiative to build a network of creative, technological, and educational spaces across Ukrainian regions, in regional communities, in small regional communities as well. They aren't just the shelters, they are launch pods equipped with VR sets, 3D printers, scanners, digital labs designed for children, veterans, creators, and communities to rebuild not only their cities, but also their dreams. Each space will be a microcosm of the future of Ukraine we believed in. So inclusive, innovative, empowered, and modern. And the aim of this is to showcase the power of Ukrainians and to unleash their human potential. And first pilot will be open indoors later this summer in a small town, the motherhood of world-known painter Kazimir Malevich. He is also Ukrainian, and in Krasnokutsk community, Kharkiv region. And that's just the beginning. We are starting with this space. And maybe a few know, but over 200 years ago, in what is now Ukrainian's Kherson region, near Hola Pristan, John Paul Jones, the father of the US Navy forces, fought alongside Ukrainian Cossacks and was even initiated in their brotherhood because of his bravery. And today his monument is just nearby, like in near the White House. And you can see myself with a serious face. I just visited yesterday just to be sure it's here. And now imagine building such a space of tomorrow with all of these innovations and technologies on that very land once it's free and occupied again. A center for courage, innovations, a center for international cooperation. That's not just remembering history, that's turning it forward. And that's exactly why we invited you to join us in building it through real and meaningful partnership. We fight not only with drones, we fight with ideas. Our foundation by ourselves has a lot of cultural and humanitarian projects. Through our initiatives like Unleash Ukraine, we plan to promote Ukrainian art culture with digital technologies and innovations. We do murals that speaks for resistance, installations that collect and help us to collect donations and funds to rebuild Ukraine and to help forces. Hope we have one idea, and I hope so. Soon one will be in Washington as well. Ukrainian art and culture walks into global capitals and leaves a message. Ukraine is not a victim. Ukraine is a force. This is our culture diplomacy, and this is our soft power. Together with our other project like SkillForge, we are collecting different training systems to improve our soldiers' skills and learning with life-saving knowledges and so on. Also, we have our project for Kids UA that helps bring physical healing through VR sets and new technologies with AR and VR. So we are not a charity. We are an ecosystem foundation, an ecosystem of courage, competence, and creativity. We are turning one-time acts of help into long-term transformations. And we are building a new model of rebuilding where defense, culture, art, and technology works as a one. We don't want pity, we want partnership. The world often looks at Ukraine through the lens of war, but we invite you to look at Ukraine through a different lens. Through the eyes of child designing their first robot in a village that once lived in silence. Through the hands of veterans learning to 3D printing business and to doing crafts on it. Through the mural on a wall that says, tomorrow lives here. Ukraine is not just defending itself. Ukraine is inventing its future and inviting the world to cooperate. Tomorrow has the address. It's Ukraine. Let's partner in shaping the future together. Thank you, guys.
I think you know over the many people I've brought to Ukraine over the years, and especially since the current fighting began. I think one of the most surprising things to Americans that have not traveled a lot is how many people think about and have a belief in the future. And that's also why I believe Ukraine comes out in a good place at some point. Rounding out the panel will be David Kirichenko. He's a researcher and an expert who writes about autonomous systems, cyber warfare, irregular warfare, and military strategy. And he's not an armchair quarterback, having spent time in Bakhmut and Chastan Yar on the front lines. And we'll look forward to hearing your comments.
Excellent. Well, thank you for the introduction and for having me. I think my perspective on Ukrainian identity will be reliant on my experiences on the front line and the work that I've gotten to do with Ukrainian soldiers and people and volunteers. And for me, some of my father's side of the family is from Donbass. And so even as a child, I would go and visit Donetsk, Crimea, Slavyansk, Kramatorsk. And even as a child, I got the ability to talk to a lot of the locals and people, even across where the war zone is today, and understand what people thought and what their perspectives are on Ukraine and Russia, Ukraine-Russia relations, Ukraine's history. And of course, it's well known that Ukraine's transformation, or Ukrainians' understanding of themselves, radically changed after 2014 and especially after 2022. And you have both the soldiers and the common people talking more and more about Ukraine's historical plight, events such as the Holodomor, where millions of people were starved to death, and just even understanding of why it is important for Ukrainians to be fighting today on the front line. And even if I was to address the topic of draft dodgers and what's going on with the Ukrainian men wanting or not wanting to fight, I think even that is very diverse and unique with many nuances, right? Whether it's the Protestants from Ukraine, which are not as nationalistic and and the further that you get away from the front line, the more that you have some of these different religious groups across Ukraine having a different perspective on what it means to take up arms and to fight. I would reckon with more research, we'd have an interesting breakdown versus Greek Catholics that went to go fight versus Ukrainian Orthodox, Ukrainian Protestants, and you would have, based on religious views, a different perspective of engagement on the front line, and whether they're focused on more humanitarian efforts or taking up arms. And even of the fact that, of course, for me, it's difficult to judge people who've ran away, whether they have family that they need to take care of and they run away. But if you see what it's like on the front lines and see with how little the Ukrainians are fighting with, and just how scary it is out there on the front line, it's hard to judge or not want to go out there, avoid going out there. I mean, it's pure hell out there when you think about the skies are filled with drones. Death is so random at every moment. The battles are just so chaotic out there. The glide bombs, the heavy artillery, the heavy armor that's rolling around, the artillery that's firing. And to me, I'm just bamboozled as to how generals conduct some of these war plans and understand what's going on the battlefield, because there's just so much death and chaos that's happening at every moment. And to me, it's being embedded with some of these units and just seeing what a miracle it is that they have to pull off day in, day out. I think no one in the world truly understands just how dire it is and the miracles that soldiers have to conduct every single day on those battlefields with so little resources and support. And of course, I think with a lot more Western support and with the proper with all the resources that they need, I think a lot more men would be willing to join. And in terms of just understanding of like what people fight for, I think in talking to soldiers, so many of them understand that if I don't go and fight now, the Russians will come for my children and they will continue to seek to destroy Ukrainian identity. And that's why it's important to show up and fight now for as long as it takes, because if we surrender or we give up, this war is going to continue well into the future. And there's no chance that, if they freeze the war, something is going to stop. And so, why don't we ask ourselves, why have so many Ukrainian men, even a state, that has its challenges and maybe hasn't had such a strong government throughout these last few decades to be proud of, yet the Ukrainian soldiers took up arms and the Ukrainian people have defied all the odds and the expectations and continue to fight back. And I think the world continues to be so surprised, whether it's Operation Spiderweb or, at the start of the invasion of the resistance that Ukraine's been able to put up. And we continue to look at Ukraine from a Russian perspective, right? Whether that's Eurasian or Russian studies across the West, and just how we look at Ukraine, or even the advisors that we have, whether it's like in the White House or anything to do with foreign policy, both across Europe and the US, or even if you look at journalists and how for decades you would have journalists based out of Moscow and the press bureaus being in Moscow, and they'd fly in, come into Ukraine, take a quick story and leave. And so our understanding of Ukraine and Ukrainian identity has been so twisted. And now the world is learning so much, and the Ukrainians continue to surprise us. And, I think the historians will speak to this better, but Ukraine's unique history of going back to the Cossacks and how Ukrainians have never rallied around a very strong state and have had a very strong desire to be a free people and fighting for that. And I think one of my main points I'll make is that Ukrainian identity and this belief in freedom and decentralization is very important on the battlefield. If you think about what Ukraine struggles with, even from a command structure in the military or decisions made on the battlefield, a lot of it stems from the Soviet architecture of the remnants of the Soviet Union that exists within the military and decision making. And some of Ukraine's successes on the battlefield, you can tie it back to being decentralized and allowing commanders at the lowest level to make battlefield decisions. And arguably, this is one of the key reasons why Ukraine had successes in Kharkiv, when you empower commanders at the lowest levels to make quick decisions, exploit gaps, and advance on the battlefield, whereas the Russians are very top down. And so the more that the Ukrainians, like especially within the military, can continue to advance these reforms and get as further away from all these Soviet structures, it has a direct impact on the battlefield. And Ukraine, to its credit, has made a lot of progress, and there's still a lot more to be done. But the more that Ukraine continues building its identity, both for the common people, for even its armed forces, the more impact that it's having and its ability to resist. And to me, one thing that I continue to be surprised by is the amount of Ukrainian soldiers, for example, that speak Russian. I would guess that over half the soldiers that I've met or spent time with across the front lines or being in cities under siege, they majority, if not close to a majority, speak Russian. And there's no sense of you speak Russian, I speak Ukrainian, and there's a difference between us. They're all united in a common vision for what Ukraine should be like in the future and what freedoms people should have, and not allowing a strong authoritarian to rule over Ukraine and the Ukrainian people, which goes back centuries. And I think it's important both for the government and Kyiv to continue to retain trust and preserve freedom and maintain that trust within Ukrainian society, allowing it to continue to evolve and shaping its identity. And yeah, thank you for allowing me to give my comments.
Wish more Americans could hear discussions like this about Ukraine reality. In New Hampshire, they have the saying, live free or die. But that's a concept that's beyond the experience of many Americans today, especially those in the MAGNA world that are anti-Ukraine. They simply can't visualize what it is not to live free, and they can't visualize having something so dear that you'd be willing to risk your life. And that's part of the messaging problem that we have. The other problem we have is we have about 10 minutes to get a couple more cards in, I think from Pavlo and also to David and myself, and then we'll see if we have time for questions. Pavlo, do you want to start giving scores? Oh, yeah. Oh, Janusz can begin.
Categories again. Common past 4 on the way to 5. Commons future 4.5 on the way to 5. Common present, as Alex said, give 5.
Yeah.
And what's the last one?
Ability to overcome devastating effects of war.
Oh, fine.
Yeah. Okay. We'll give mine. Sense of a common past is a 4. Immediate past, 5, absolutely. Ability to forge unity out of plurality, 4.5. And overcoming devastating effects of war, 5. And Pavlo?
It has to be
it's just like it's hard to say. Maybe I can pass.
Well,
I will pass.
You'll pass. I don't
just
know if
like
David wants to.
didn't get.
David, do you want to make scores or pass?
I mean, for the common past, I would say we're a 5, and a common future a 5, and ability to forge unity, I would give it about a 3. I think that's heavily dependent on what shapes up and both the political dynamics, what happens with the military after the war, how veterans are integrated, and numerous other variables. So very much subject to change. And the ability to overcome the devastating effects of war is a 5.
Good. Now we'll take 2 or 3 questions in a row, give our panelists a chance to answer, and then we'll turn it back over to Walter. Questions? Microphone to the back.
My name is Adrian. I'm with the Ukrainian-American Youth Civics Club as a moderator. This is for Mr. Bugaisky. So as you've mentioned, the Prometheanist movement, the original Prometheanist movement with Pilsudski ultimately did fail. Ukraine ended up occupied, and so did the Baltic countries. How can we assure a successful Prometheanist movement in today's world, as opposed to the past in the intermarium?
Great question. Is this on? Yeah, great question. Thank you very much. I think there's been this is the third phase of Prometheism. As you mentioned, the first, it wasn't just Pilsudski. There were Ukrainian colleagues of his that were also involved in the Promethean movement. Ukraine was one of the countries, not the only, but one of the countries that also wanted to break free of the Russian Empire. A few did: Finland, Poland, the three Baltic states. Unfortunately, Ukraine was sold down the river at the Treaty of Riga by the Polish government that tended to be heavily influenced by the ethnic, the Endecja, the ethnic side, the Dmowski side of the political spectrum, as well as by Western pressure. So it failed in terms of helping Ukraine, but it certainly was successful in pulling certain states out of the Russian Empire. The second phase of Prometheism was after World War II, particularly during the Cold War. Some of it was based around Kultura and Jerzy Giedroyc in Paris, who was talking about reconciliation between Poles and Ukrainians and independent Ukraine, independent Belarus, independent Lithuania, and no contentious border questions between them. So there was strong support, as we saw, when communism collapsed in the Soviet bloc and the Soviet Union began to unravel. There was very strong support for the independence of nations within the Soviet Union. So I would say that was the second stage of Prometheism. This is where Ukraine finally emerged as an independent state, as well as 15 other republics. And now I think we've entered the third stage, because we've recognized that the Russian Federation is not Russia. It is still is a colonial empire. Somewhere between 30 and 35% of the population actually non-Ruski. A lot of the Russians themselves are not monolithic. There's a huge difference between those in Kryleviets or Kaliningrad and Khabarovsk or Primorsky or Siberia. So, and there's a lot of regionalist movements that were stirred actually when the Soviet Union collapsed within the Russian Federation. So, you know, Prometheism now, I would say, is the third stage, focuses not only on the independence, I would say, of nations still trapped within Russia, within the Russian Federation, but also regions with rich resources that can do much better without Moscow, that can develop relations with their neighbors, from Japan to Finland to Norway to eventually Ukraine as well. And the second part of it would be, if we want to assure peace, we have to finally dismantle the empire, the colonial empire. Ukraine cannot be faced with another war in the next generation, because we failed to complete the job this time. So I think a lot of focus in Ukraine, I think, is very much aware of this. I'll be talking to people in Kyiv who are very much focused on helping the free nations and even regions in Russia to finally extract themselves from Russian Federation and declare their liberation. Question is the steps towards that goal, but that goal needs to be achieved. That, I would say, is the third stage of Prometheism in a nutshell.
Does anybody else want to comment? Maybe I'll make one final comment. When you talk about Pilsudski, I think about the perfect example of Russian imperialist attitude. When Pilsudski beat Trotsky's Red Army and they had to surrender territory, Lenin was criticized within the Communist Party for giving up territory. What was his response? Now we need peace. When we're stronger, we'll take it back. And what, 18 years later, as an ally of Nazi Germany, invaded again. So anyway, thanks so much to everybody, and to Walter. We'll turn it over to you to close out.
Panel was exactly like the others, all aces, and I you know, at the end of this process, I must say, man, that I'm stunned by the level of the folks that we have. This time, I swear to God, I don't think there was an ounce of fat in this conference. So I'm still stunned. I'm lost words, but I think my friend Andrij Dobriansky, he always seems to be able to wrap up things for us. So I'm going to let him wrap this up for us. Okay. And Janusz, thank you. Alex, thank you. David, thank you.
All right, tally master time. I tried to do the math because there were some categories that were very much united. Let's start with the first set of speakers that we had for robust democratic politics, assessing Ukraine's progress regress. We had an overwhelming amount of 4s throughout, with 4.5. So I'm going to give it a 4.2. Overall, for the overall grade panel average for that was democratic politics. Moving on to developed market economics. We had more 4.5s in this one than we had in the previous one. 4.5 towards 5 overall, but as a whole, that was slightly higher at 4.5. That was for developed market economics. Ever greater general security. That one, we had a bunch of 3s and a bunch of 3.5s, given the fact that that was the actual reality. But we also, on the flip side, received a lot of 4.5s for what could be done. Then there was a bunch of 1s and 2s in there as well. So overall, my average was a 3.5 or even, that was even greater general security. So there's lots of stuff that could be done. There's lots of stuff that was being done. But overall, some of the way the categories or the suggested themes were gave us low marks there. When we go to greater energy security, we have a lot of 5s for the effort. Between 3s and 4s for the reality of things. So given that, you know, we're generous graders here, we'll go with the 4 for the even greater general security. Viable social cohesion, we have, again, that was another all over the place, but a solid, I would say 4 would be a nice grade to put on it. There was the awkward question about messaging, which got us not just a 3 but a -3 on one. So but let's give it a solid 4 though. And then the final one is probably the highest marks overall, which is for mature national identity. There were nothing really lower than a 4.5. David had that 1.3 in there, but then he had the highest marks overall for everything else. So we're going to go with a solid 4.8 for mature national identity, which I think is kind of the goal overall. If you don't have that, you don't have squat. So in contrast to last year, a couple of people mentioned, especially in energy, slightly different in terms of what the grades are this year. I do encourage everybody, we do have every single one of these working group summits, these report card summits, we have every single one online dating back to 2019. So it's, especially for a conference like this, as opposed to some of our other events, this is a good one to measure a mark of where we're going. And as I finished my grading, I do want to stress the mature nation statehood. That's kind of the end all be all. And if you look at the previous ones, there were a bunch of question marks at those early years leading into the pandemic. Really question marks during the pandemic. We had 2 years in a row where we were doing this June conference online. And that was a question mark of how we were cohesive in that respect. We had a big spike in 2022 for our June conference there. And then after the last 2 years, the fact that we're at this point, the fact that we have not even hit 150 days of this new administration in the United States. And it only seems as if Ukraine is not only uniting more, but Ukraine is able to lead the way, whether you're talking about what's happening against the other enemies in Iran, whether you're talking about scores of foreign fighters that have been asked by our enemy to fight on their behalf, and they have been decimated this year, Ukraine only seems to be getting better. So hopefully our work here and all of our wonderful experts, hopefully we can put that in context for hopefully when we have a 10-year retrospective online, everybody can have a better sense of where Ukraine is going. But at this point, if you look at our 10 years that are all available online on YouTube or on Facebook, you can see a steady progression towards where we ended this last session at 4.8 overall grade for really the theme of the entire event. I would also like to thank all of our partners here. So it's not just Walter's work at the Center for U.S.-Ukrainian Relations with Mykola, with Roman here as well. We also want to thank our two main partners who speak at the beginning for every single one of these conferences. That's the NDI, the National Democratic Institute, and the IRI, International Republican Institute. As had been mentioned by both representatives today, both of those have looked now to different funding with a lot of grants being cut to them. Remember that when people are talking politics, you have seen them here at the event every time. So make sure you understand what IRI and NDI is. My person on behalf of the Ukrainian Congress Committee, and Michael was here earlier as well, the president, as well as the Ukrainian National Information Service. And then, of course, without the work of the American Foreign Policy Council, I don't think we're here not just in this room. I don't think we're here in Washington, D.C., and I don't think we're heard as much in the halls of Washington. So Herman, thank you not only for chairing a panel like you do every year, but thank you for all the work that AFPC and the entire AFPC team, both in this room and back at the office. Speaking of that, we want to remind everybody that we will be gathering at AFPC after this for those invited to attend the patrons reception. And then lastly, let's mention those patrons. Without them, we can't do this at all. A big thank you to Self-Reliance New York Federal Credit Union, a wonderful institution that is going through some changes of its own. So please read up on all those developments. The Heritage Foundation of the First Security Federal Savings Bank, always being a reliable partner for this, allowing us to tell our story in this city of think tanks. The Summa Federal Credit Union for consistently, especially this conference every year, coming up with a nice donation, as well as the Berezan Port Project. You guys can not only hear John talk about the Berezan Port Project, but within his biography, you can look up the Berezan Port Project. So he not only had the presentation, but you can look up Berezan Port Project in his biography and find the website for that. And then two more, the Nawrocky Torielli family and their charitable fund. They have been, this is the third year in a row, I believe, that they've been the sponsor, a patron of this reception, as well as our wonderful friends at Unique Print in New York for always coming in, even if the deadline is at the last minute. Vlodko knows who to turn to. And with that, I wrap up our 2025 session. I welcome you all to look up all these videos online. We'll have the timestamps up on them by the weekend. All of the previous videos have timestamps on them, as well as links to everybody's organization. And then we should be gathering back here, Vlodko, in October. Maybe not in this physical space, but we will be back in Washington for another big event that will mark 1 year before the midterms. So I encourage everybody not just to get involved in local politics this year, Virginia elections. I'm going back to city council elections in New York City. But when we gather in October, I believe that'll be the last time that anybody's talking about anything but elections in Washington. So we will be here to give a solid set of things for those people who are going back home to start campaigning. They will understand that Ukrainians, with the help of our friends, a little bit of help of our friends, we're organized and we're going to keep our message out. Thank you very much. 5:16, 1 minute over, sorry.